Frank Sinatra swung a sledgehammer into the concrete helipad he'd built with his own money. Not because he was angry, because he was heartbroken. The helipad had cost him over one. He'd added new guest rooms, a new phone system, extra security, everything a sitting president of the United States might need for a weekend in Palm Springs. He'd told everyone who would listen Jack Kennedy was coming. The president was going to stay at his house. But Jack Kennedy never came, and what hurt Frank Sinatra wasn't the money. It wasn't the embarrassment. It was the realization that he had been used and then thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. To understand what drove Frank Sinatra to destroy his own property with his bare hands, you need to understand what he did for John F. Kennedy, and more importantly, what he thought their friendship meant. Frank Sinatra didn't just support political candidates, he owned them. In 1959, he was the most powerful entertainer in America. His records sold millions. His films grossed tens of millions more. When Frank Sinatra walked into a room, the room changed. People straightened their ties. Conversations stopped. Everyone waited to see what he would do next. He had money. He had fame. He had connections that reached from Hollywood to Las Vegas, to places most people only whispered about. But there was one thing Frank Sinatra didn't have: legitimacy. The whispers followed him everywhere. Mob connections, organized crime, the dark rumors about how he'd gotten out of his contract with Tommy Dorsey. Frank could fill Madison Square Garden, but he couldn't get invited to the right dinner parties in Washington. Then Peter Lawford introduced him to a young senator from Massachusetts. Peter Lawford was a British actor, charming but lightweight. He'd married into the Kennedy family, Patricia Kennedy, one of Jack's sisters, and suddenly found himself connected to American royalty. Peter knew everyone in Hollywood, and he knew that Frank Sinatra wanted something no amount of money could buy. Frank, Peter said one evening at a party, "You should meet Jack. You two would get along." Frank looked across the room at the young senator, tall, handsome. That smile that seemed to promise something better was coming. "Set it up," Frank said. The first meeting happened at Lawford's beach house in Santa Monica. Jack Kennedy was everything Frank had expected and more. He was witty, irreverent, completely unimpressed by Hollywood's celebrity. He treated Frank like an equal, not a performer to be hired for parties, but a man whose opinion mattered. They talked for hours: politics, women, power, the way the world really worked. Jack Kennedy understood power. He'd grown up surrounded by it. His father, Joseph Kennedy, had made fortunes in ways that weren't always legal. The Kennedys knew how to play the game, and Frank Sinatra knew how to play it too. By the end of that first evening, something had clicked. Frank saw in Jack Kennedy a path to the respectability he'd always craved. And Jack saw in Frank Sinatra something equally valuable: access. Access to Hollywood money. Access to celebrity endorsements. Access to a world that could make a presidential campaign feel like the most glamorous show on earth. "If you ever run for president," Frank said,
raising his glass, "I'm your man."
Jack smiled that famous smile. "I might take you up on that." He did. When John F. Kennedy announced his candidacy for president in January 1960, Frank Sinatra became his most valuable weapon. Frank didn't just write checks, though he wrote plenty of those. He organized. He called in every favor he'd accumulated over 20 years in show business. He convinced celebrities who'd never expressed a political opinion in their lives to suddenly become passionate Kennedy supporters. Sammy Davis Jr., Dean Martin, Shirley MacLaine, Tony Curtis, Janet Leigh, the biggest names in entertainment, all lined up behind the young senator from Massachusetts. But Frank did more than gather celebrities. He worked the other side too. The side nobody talked about in polite company. Frank Sinatra knew people. People in Chicago. People in Las Vegas. People whose names appeared in FBI files and whose faces appeared in mugshots. And in 1960, those people could deliver something more valuable than celebrity endorsements. They could deliver votes. The story would be debated for decades afterward. Did the Chicago mob really swing the Illinois primary for Kennedy? Did Sam Giancana's organization stuff ballot boxes and intimidate voters? The truth was buried under layers of denial and destroyed evidence. But Frank Sinatra believed he had delivered. He believed he had given Jack Kennedy the presidency. The night of the election, November 8, 1960, Frank watched the returns at his home in Palm Springs. The race was close, impossibly close. Nixon led, then Kennedy, then Nixon again. The hours crawled by. Finally, in the early morning hours, the news came through. Illinois had gone to Kennedy, by a margin so thin it seemed almost impossible. John F. Kennedy would be the next president of the United States. Frank Sinatra poured himself a drink and stared at the television screen. He had done it. He had helped put his friend in the White House. Now it was time to collect. The inaugural gala was Frank Sinatra's masterpiece. He produced the entire show himself. He called in every favor, pulled every string, worked 18-hour days for weeks to create a spectacle worthy of the new president. The night of January 19, 1961, the eve of the inauguration, Washington, D.C. was hit by a massive snowstorm. 8 inches of snow buried the Capitol. Traffic came to a standstill. The city was paralyzed. But Frank Sinatra's show went on. He had Harry Belafonte, Ella Fitzgerald, Gene Kelly, Jimmy Durante, Nat King Cole, Mahalia Jackson, the greatest performers in America, all on one stage, all there because Frank Sinatra had asked. And in the presidential box, Jack Kennedy watched it all with that smile on his face. After the show, Frank made his way to the box. The president-elect stood and embraced him. "Frank," Kennedy said, "that was the best show I've ever seen." Frank felt something he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. He felt legitimate. The months after the inauguration were the best of Frank Sinatra's life. He visited the White House. He had the president's private phone number. When he threw parties at his Palm Springs compound, he dropped Jack's name casually, watching the faces of his guests transform with new respect. Frank Sinatra wasn't just an entertainer anymore. He was a friend of the president. He decided to prove it. In early 1962, Frank began a massive renovation of his Palm Springs estate. He added new guest cottages, installed a new communications system, built a flagpole for the presidential flag, and he built a helipad, a concrete helipad, specially designed for Marine One, the presidential helicopter. It cost over $100,000, a fortune in 1962 dollars. But Frank didn't care about the money. He cared about what it represented. The President of the United States was going to stay at his house. He told everyone. He told his friends, his staff. The President was coming to Palm Springs, and he was going to stay with Frank Sinatra. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Frank was in his living room, going over the final preparations for the presidential visit. He'd planned everything down to the smallest detail. The right wines, the right cigars, the right company, discreet, elegant, Kennedy style. The phone rang. It was Peter Lawford. "Frank," Peter said. His voice was strange, tight. "I need to tell you something." Frank felt something cold in his stomach. He'd known Peter Lawford for years. He'd never heard him sound like this. "What is it?" A pause. Frank could hear Peter breathing on the other end of the line. "The president isn't coming." Frank didn't move. "What do you mean he isn't coming? The visit is in 3 days." "I know, but he's going to stay somewhere else." "Somewhere else? What the hell does that mean?" "I built a helipad, Peter. I built him a goddamn helipad." Another pause, longer this time. "He's staying with Bing." Frank felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Bing Crosby, his rival, his predecessor, the man he'd spent his entire career trying to surpass. "You're joking, Frank." "I'm sorry, it wasn't my decision. It was Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, Jack's little brother, the one who had declared war on organized crime, the one who had been building cases against the same people Frank had asked for help during the campaign. Bobby thinks your connections are a liability, with everything that's happening with the Justice Department investigations. He convinced Jack that it would look bad. The president staying at your house with your RAR associations." Frank's hand tightened on the phone. "My associations, I see. My associations were fine when you needed money, when you needed votes, when you needed me to deliver Illinois, Frank. But now I'm a liability." "It's not personal." "The hell it's not personal." Frank's voice dropped to a whisper. "I gave you people everything, and this is how you repay me?" "Frank, I tried. I really did." "Go to hell, Peter." Frank hung up the phone. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still. Outside, the California sun was shining. The helipad gleamed white in the afternoon light. The flagpole stood empty, waiting for a flag that would never fly. Then Frank Sinatra walked to his garage, found a sledgehammer and went to work. The first swing cracked the concrete. Frank brought the sledgehammer down again, and again, and again. His staff watched from the windows, too afraid to intervene. They'd seen Frank angry before. They'd seen him throw phones, overturn tables, scream at people until they fled in tears. But they'd never seen anything like this. He wasn't screaming now. He wasn't saying anything at all, just swinging the sledgehammer, methodically, relentlessly, breaking apart the helipad piece by piece. Jilly Rizzo, Frank's bodyguard and closest friend, finally stepped outside. "Frank, what are you doing?" Frank didn't answer. He swung again. A chunk of concrete broke free and tumbled across the ground. "Frank, stop, you're gonna hurt yourself." Frank finally paused. He was breathing hard, sweat soaking through his shirt. He looked at Jilly with eyes that held something beyond anger. "I built this for him, Jilly. I built this with my own money. For my friend. I know. He was supposed to come here. He was supposed to stand right here." Frank pointed at the destroyed helipad. "The President of the United States. My friend." Jilly didn't say anything. What could he say? "You know what the worst part is?" Frank's voice cracked. "The worst part is, I actually believed it. I actually thought I was finally one of them. That I wasn't just the singer they hired for parties. That I mattered." He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "But I'm still just the kid from Hoboken. Still just the guinea with mob connections. No matter what I do, no matter what I give them." He swung the sledgehammer one more time. The last section of helipad shattered. Frank dropped the hammer and walked back inside. He didn't speak for the rest of the day. Peter Lawford called the next morning. Frank refused to take the call, and the call after that, and every call Peter Lawford would ever make for the rest of their lives. They had been friends for 15 years. They had made movies together, partied together, shared secrets and everything that friendship between powerful men entailed. Peter Lawford had introduced Frank to Jack Kennedy, had been the bridge between Hollywood and Camelot. None of it mattered anymore. As far as Frank Sinatra was concerned, Peter Lawford no longer existed. His name was removed from Sinatra's address book. His calls were blocked. His messages were thrown away unread. Peter Lawford spent years trying to repair the relationship. He wrote letters. He sent intermediaries. He publicly apologized, privately begged, did everything a man could do to earn forgiveness. It never came. Peter Lawford would die in 1984, alone and broke, estranged from the Kennedy family that had used him and the friends he had betrayed. Frank Sinatra did not attend the funeral. Meanwhile, Bobby Kennedy continued his war on organized crime. The same people who had allegedly helped deliver the 1960 election found themselves under constant surveillance, their phones tapped, their businesses raided, their associates arrested one by one. Sam Giancana was furious. He had expected gratitude from the Kennedys. He had expected protection, or at least to be left alone. Instead, he was being hunted. The irony was not lost on Frank Sinatra. He and Sam Giancana had something in common now. They had both been used by the Kennedys, and then discarded. But Frank's feelings toward Jack Kennedy himself remained complicated. He was angry, a deep, burning anger that would never fully fade. But underneath the anger was something else, something that felt uncomfortably like love. Jack Kennedy had been his friend, or at least Frank had believed he was his friend, and Frank Sinatra did not give his friendship lightly, or take its loss easily. Frank was in Los Angeles when he heard the news on November 2. He was at a recording session, working on a new album, when someone burst into the studio with a transistor radio. "The president's been shot." The room went silent. Musicians put down their instruments. Engineers stepped away from their board. Everyone gathered around the small radio, listening to the crackling reports from Dallas. Then the announcement came. "The president is dead." Frank walked out of the studio without a word. He got in his car and drove home. He locked himself in his room and didn't come out for 3 days. He had loved Jack Kennedy, despite everything, despite the helipad and the humiliation and the years of being frozen out. He had loved him the way you love a friend who disappoints you, with anger and grief, and a terrible sense of weight. Tina Sinatra, Frank's daughter, would later describe those days after the assassination. "He was devastated, completely devastated. Whatever had happened between them, my father never stopped caring about Jack. Losing him was like losing a brother." In the years that followed, Frank Sinatra changed. He had always been a Democrat. He had supported Roosevelt, Truman, Stevenson, Kennedy. He had been one of the most visible liberal voices in Hollywood. But the Kennedy betrayal broke something in him. Slowly, Frank began to drift. He grew closer to Ronald Reagan, then the governor of California. He started attending Republican fundraisers. He stopped talking about the causes he had once championed. By 1970, he had publicly endorsed Ronald Reagan for governor. By 1972, He was supporting Richard Nixon for president. The transformation was complete. The man who had organized the inaugural gala for John F. Kennedy became one of the most prominent Republican supporters in Hollywood, and when Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, it was Frank Sinatra who organized his inaugural gala. History had come full circle. In 1985, President Ronald Reagan presented Frank Sinatra with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The ceremony was held at the White House, the same White House Frank had visited as a guest of Jack Kennedy, before everything fell apart. 23 years after Jack Kennedy chose Bing Crosby over him, Frank Sinatra had finally gotten what he wanted: legitimacy, respect, a place at the table. But some wounds never fully heal. Years later, a reporter asked Frank about his relationship with the Kennedys. Frank's face went hard. His eyes turned cold. "I don't discuss the Kennedys," he said. "But I said I don't discuss the Kennedys." The subject was never raised again. Frank Sinatra died on May 14. He had outlived Jack Kennedy by 35 years, Bobby Kennedy by 30, Peter Lawford by 14. He had outlived almost everyone who had been involved in that painful chapter of his life. At his funeral they played My Way. They buried him with a bottle of Jack Daniels, a pack of Camel cigarettes, and a dime, so he could call Dean Martin in heaven. No one mentioned the Kennedys. Frank Sinatra gave Jack Kennedy everything: his money, his connections, his influence, his heart, and Jack Kennedy gave him Bing Crosby's address. Some say Frank never forgave the Kennedys. Others say he forgave them long ago, but could never forget. The truth was probably somewhere in between. He was a man of deep loyalties and deeper grudges, capable of loving with all his heart and hating with equal intensity. The helipad was rebuilt eventually. Frank had it reconstructed years later, after the wound had scarred over, but it was never used by a president. It stood there, empty, a monument to a friendship that almost was. That's the thing about Frank Sinatra. He built things for people he loved. He built them with his own hands and his own money, because that's how he showed what someone meant to him. And when they betrayed him, he tore those things down with the same hands, because that's how he showed his pain. Peter Lawford learned that lesson too late. Jack Kennedy never learned it at all. But everyone who knew Frank Sinatra understood. You were either with him or against him. There was no middle ground. There was no second chance. You got one shot at his friendship, and God help you if you wasted it. That's the chairman of the board. That's Frank Sinatra.